On September 2, 1877, a funeral was held for Brigham Young in the massive tabernacle in the heart of Salt Lake City. Fittingly, Young had dictated every aspect of his funeral and burial, one last set of directives to the Mormon people he had led for more than 30 years.
He could be stern when occasion demanded, but he was the wisest, kindest, and most loving of father. The bond between my father and me was as close as if I had been the only child. I shall always be grateful that I was born his daughter. Susa Young Gates.
But in death as in life, Brigham Young produced sharply divided opinion. National magazines printed cartoons mocking the loss felt by his plural wives, and locally, the rambunctious Salt Lake Tribune offered a snarling obituary.
The world knows that Brigham Young was a very unworthy specimen of humanity, that he was groveling and selfish in his instincts, that he was unscrupulous in his choice of means to carry out his purposes, and that he abused the most noble opportunities of usefulness. The Salt Lake Tribune.
The Utah Territory was sharply and deeply divided as it considered a future without its central founding figure.
But in fact, there were really two separate economies, and there were two separate social cultures, and obviously there was a very different, there was a great gulf with very different ideas of religion on each sides of that particular gulf.
It set a situation in which Utah became the national manifestation of a conflict over federal authority, and Brigham Young died just at the time that the U.S. government had ceased its reconstruction of the South, and Utah was the next obvious target.
At the death of the Mormon chieftain is the time for the United States government to strike. Turn their vast temples into arsenals, and let Phil Sheridan after them. Give him enough troops, and he will teach all Utah that 40 wives is 39 too many. Reverend DeWitt Talmadge.
In this highly charged and uncertain atmosphere, leadership of the Mormon people and the immediate future of the Utah Territory fell on the shoulders of John Taylor.
John Taylor is an extraordinarily intelligent individual, extraordinarily gifted, and in many ways he has a kind of sense of future economic development that's missing in Brigham Young's thought. And yet he's intensely loyal to what he perceives as central principles in the church.
Blunt and even combative, Taylor would refuse to yield ground on deeply held principles, regardless of the outcry beyond the territorial borders. For Taylor, the Utah Territory and the nation, there was no more symbolic principle than polygamy. From the moment the Mormon Church publicly acknowledged plural marriage as a principle of its religion in 1852, the nation had been gripped by a morbid fascination of what was called the peculiar institution. Often portrayed in the national media as thinly disguised harem building in the Wild West, the mislabeled concept of polygamy was a deeply held religious principle among Mormons.
We are accused of being downtrodden and oppressed. We deny the charge. True, we practice plural marriage, not, however, because we are compelled to, but because we are convinced that it is a divine revelation, and we find in this principle satisfaction, contentment, and more happiness than we can obtain in any other relationship. Dr. Ellis R. Shipp.
So beginning with that principle, you know that women entered into that particular form of marriage believing it was the right thing to do. I don't think any of them ever liked it. I think that many of them were determined to make the very best of it.
If anyone in this world thinks plural marriage is not a trial, they are wrong. Sadie Jacobson.
While national fascination settled on men like Heber C. Kimball, who claimed more than 40 wives, in reality, plural marriage was never practiced by a majority of Mormons. It was, however, fully practiced by church leadership, including church president John Taylor, and was a primary target for critics of the Mormon Church as the decade of the 1880s dawned.
To the women of America, let every happy wife and mother who reads these pages have her sympathy, prayers, and efforts aimed to free her sisters from this degrading bondage. Let all the women of this country stand united for them. There's a power in combined enlightened sentiment and sympathy before which every form of injustice and cruelty must finally go down. Harriet Beecher Stowe.
The debate often raged over the heads of the plural wives of the Utah Territory, a group that included some of the most eloquent and politically active voices of the 19th century women's movement.
On the one hand, they had this urge, this impulse in them to speak for the rights of all women, to call for better lives for all women. At the same time, they also were the clearest, most passionate proponents for this doctrine that seemed to contradict everything that the national movement was pushing for.
Polygamy had endured for almost 20 years since Congress passed the law of just and moral outlawing its practice in 1862. But now Congress clamored for a new crackdown. John Taylor, however, was adamant. Polygamy was a principle, and the Mormon people would not yield on principle. As if to underscore the theme of dedication and commitment to their faith, a party of Mormon settlers set out in 1879 on the most remarkable journey of the pioneer era. Working their way across the harsh slick rock of southern Utah, 250 settlers sought passage to the last unsettled corner of the territory, in the land south and east of the Colorado River. They would be forced to lower their wagons through a small notch in the rock, down sheer cliffs to the banks of the Colorado River, across the river, then up the other side.
7 span of horses were used so that when some of the horses were on their knees fighting to get up to find a foothold, the still erect horses could plunge forward against the sharp grade. The worst stretches could be identified by the dried blood and matted hair from the forelegs of the struggling teams. Charles read.
The path became known as the Hole in the Rock, a tangible act of courage in settling the San Juan region of the Utah Territory, and a reminder of the dogged determination of the unique people of the territory to hold to their path in the face of obstacles. In 1878, the mining town of Alta burned to the ground. In Salt Lake City, the editor of the Tribune was jumped by a mob outside his office and beaten with brass knuckles. But for nearly 150,000 residents of the Utah Territory, the big story was in Washington. In its Capitol hearing room, the Supreme Court had just finished listening to arguments in the case of George Reynolds versus the United States. For years, the Mormons had argued that their practice of polygamy was protected by the Constitution as a matter of religious freedom. On January 6, 1879, the Court of Last Resort provided an answer.
To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and, in effect, to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Government could only exist in name under such circumstances. Morrison R. Waite, Chief Justice.
What they say is that, look, you can believe anything you want to, but you can't practice things that the sense of the community believes are detrimental to the community. It's a kind of difference between belief and action.
Certain their trust in the Constitution would be vindicated, the decision instead placed the Mormon Church beyond the protection of the Constitution.
Let us plant the seeds of devastation in a thriving, peaceful, industrious community. Let us tear asunder that mighty shield of the rights of conscience, our glorious Constitution. Thus saith the Supreme Court of the United States. Eliza Roxy Snow.
God is greater than the United States, and when the government conflicts with heaven, we will be ranged under the banner of heaven against the government. I defy the United States. I will obey God. John Taylor.
President Rutherford B. Hayes viewed the Supreme Court decision as removing any doubt about efforts to crush polygamy, and he took it as a mandate to go after the Mormon Church. He ordered his Secretary of State, William Evarts, to take all steps necessary to bar future immigration of Mormons to the United States.
Mr. Evarts informs Europe that bigamy is punishable by law. The truth, however, is that the United States, after many years of unavailing effort, find themselves utterly unable to crush the Mormons. The London Examiner.
The national mood turned ugly. Mormon missionaries were beaten, and one, Joseph Standing, was murdered by a mob in the South. In the face of the onslaught, Mormon Church President John Taylor defied the federal government.
And John Taylor set the church as an institution and the Mormon people individually on a course of collision with the federal government.
They can imprison or shoot any number of us. There will always be somebody left to carry on the work. John Taylor.
In the eyes of the nation, the future of the Utah Territory was inseparable from the Mormon Church. And at the start of the 1880s, the territory and the church became the target of a national crusade.
Mormonism will never be destroyed until it's destroyed by the guns of the United States government.
The most strident voice belonged to the Reverend DeWitt Talmage, a popular and animated minister based in New York.
If the Mormons submit to the law, all right. If not, then send our troops and let them make the Mormon Tabernacle their headquarters, and with cannons of biggest bore, thunder into them the 7th commandment.
Soon, religious organizations throughout the country had adopted polygamy as the nation's greatest social evil.
Be it resolved that we, in full accord with all patriotic and Christian citizens, confidently expect the continued and persistent efforts for the execution of this law. The American Baptist Home Mission Society, Saratoga Springs, New York.
The national media of the day turned its full attention to the Utah Territory. News magazines depicted polygamy as nothing more than slavery for women. The Mormon Church as a savage and alien breed capable of ruthless acts of barbarity. Church religious practices performed in the endowment house were portrayed as the sinister rites of an evil secret society.
When the people of the United States come to understand that the instant a man passes the threshold of the endowment house, he renounces allegiance to the United States, there will be more men interested in extirpating this foul institution. DeWitt Talmage.
In an era of anti-foreign sentiment, the Mormons were paired with Roman Catholics as a dangerous, disloyal faction, or with Asians as an alien culture devouring the American spirit. Above all, the media portrayed the Utah Territory's Mormons as disloyal to the nation. There was little effort to allow a Utah response to the charges. It was a firestorm of popular criticism that forced its way onto the national political agenda. In the fall of 1880, President Rutherford Hayes traveled to the West. Stopping in Salt Lake City, he spent his time with the non-Mormon community and listened intently to their horror stories of life in the Utah Territory.
Polygamy will not be abolished if the enforcement of the law depends on those who practice and uphold the crime. It can only be suppressed by taking away all political power of the sect which encourages and sustains it. The right to vote, hold office, and sit on juries in the territories must be confined to those who neither practice nor uphold polygamy. Rutherford B. Hayes.
Jumping on the mandate, Territorial Governor Eli Murray attempted to throw out the 1880 election of George Q. Cannon as Utah's delegate to Congress. Cannon had beaten his non-Mormon opponent by